Good evening and welcome to the next in our long line of virtual author programs offered by Magic City Books. I want to welcome all of you tonight and thank you for joining us. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books. We're really excited for tonight's program and really excited to have you join us. If you are joining us for the very first time, welcome. We've been doing these programs since April of 2020, and so we have over 150 recorded programs on our YouTube channel, and we invite you to check out all of our past author conversations, including a conversation between Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson, another event with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Damon Lindelof, the creator of Watchmen, and an event that we did earlier this year with tonight's moderator, Keisha Bush, where she was talking about her novel, No Heaven for Good Boys, with the author Jean Kwok. And so all of those are available on our YouTube channel. We have a couple of more virtual events coming up in the next couple of weeks. Some authors talking to authors. Next Monday night, Oklahoma debut novelist Heather Levy. She has a thriller called Walking Through Needles, and she will be in discussion with S.A. Cosby, whose first book, whose last book, I guess, Blacktop Wasteland, was highly regarded and on a lot of end-of-year best of lists the year that it came out. His newest novel, Razorblade Tears, is just landed on the New York Times bestseller list this week. And so Sean Cosby and Heather Levy will be in conversation next Monday night. And then the following Monday, we are welcoming a couple of horror writers, Emily Badea and Julianne Pacheco. I think that's how it's pronounced. The two of them are going to be joining us for kind of a women in horror night moderated by Emily Hughes from Tor, the publisher Tor. So we're really excited about those, and we're very excited that we're going to be starting to do some in-person programs as well. We have our kind of return launch event called with a author named Helen Ellis, and we're doing a book brunch on Saturday, July 24th. It's a ticketed thing, but you get breakfast for two, a copy of the book, coffee, mimosas, and we're going to have a lot of fun welcoming ourselves kind of back to in-person programs. And so all that information is at magiccitybooks.com. We are super excited tonight to be welcoming author Yaa Gyasi for the paperback release of her outstanding novel, Transcendent Kingdom. Transcendent Kingdom is a finalist for the Women's Prize in Fiction on many best of the year lists in 2020 when it came out last year. And it just came out in paperback a little earlier this month. This book is set in Alabama about a Ghanaian family that lives there, kind of centered around a PhD candidate in neuroscience, and it's just something that we are really excited about and really excited for the opportunity to have Yaa here to talk about her book. She is talking tonight to Keisha Bush, author of No Heaven for Good Boys, and a recent transplant to Tulsa. Keisha now we are her local bookstore, and we're excited to be able to have Keisha in conversation with Yaa. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Enjoy the program. And if you have questions for Yaa and Keisha, please do put those in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will get to as many as time allows. So thank you all again. Without any further ado, Keisha, I'm going to kick it off, hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Pat. Yeah, I'm so excited about this conversation. Thank you so much for just being here and joining me in this conversation. I feel very lucky, just to let you know.
Oh, thank you, Keisha. It's my pleasure.
So I will just kick it off in the very basic way most author talks are. Tell us a little bit about Transcendent Kingdom, please.
Sure, I would love to. Transcendent Kingdom, which is now out in paperback, is about a woman named Gifty who is studying for her PhD in neuroscience. And she studies something called reward-seeking behavior, which basically just means she studies things like addiction and depression. And it's at a time in her life when her own mother, who has suffered from depression in the past, is going through a second bout of major depressive disorder. And so Gifty decides to bring her mother to stay with her. And so she finds herself taking care of her mother, working through her thesis, and also thinking back on the years of her childhood that led up to her beloved older brother's passing from an opioid overdose. So it's a book about mother-daughter relationships, about addiction and depression, about religion and science. It's one of those everything but the kitchen sink novels. So it touches on a lot of different things.
It really does. And, you know, I'm trying to find the best way to sort of enter this like very big conversation I would like to have about the book. And I think I'm gonna go the micro way first. So micro. One of the things that I'm always super fascinated with all artists is sort of the origin or the original thread. And I would like to ask you, because this is like my version of literary gossip, but like gossiping about people's books with them.
Yeah.
Like what was that first thread that opened this story up? You know, did it start with Gifty, or did it start with a place? Did it start with a lab? I would love, I'm so curious. So just let us, tell me everything.
Well, there are two ways that I could answer that question. The first is to say that around the time that I finished a first draft of Homegoing, my first novel, I wanted to set it aside for a few months before going back to revise. And so I did, and I decided to work on some short stories. And one of the short stories that I wrote was about a woman who was a Gerard Manley Hopkins scholar whose mother, who had dementia, came to stay with her. And that story is called Inscape. It got published in Guernica. I really liked the voice of that story. It was so different from what I had been working on for years with Homegoing that it just felt like, you know, that palate cleanser at the end of a meal. Like it was so refreshing to write something like that. But I, you know, returned to Homegoing. That took off. My life changed. I didn't look back for many, many years. Yeah. After I finished Homegoing and was ready to start writing a new novel, I started working on something about a mother and a daughter, a really religious mother and her daughter. And it just wasn't working for some reason. And I couldn't put my finger on why. I didn't really like it. I wasn't excited to go to work every day on it. And so I could feel myself like putting it off and putting it off. Around that time, my best friend from high school, her name is Tina, she was finishing up her PhD in neuroscience. And she had always explained her work to me as being about addiction and depression. So I thought I had an understanding of it. And then she had a major paper that was due to be published. And so considering the fact that she had been so supportive of me and my career, I thought, okay, here's my chance. I'm going to sit down and read her paper. And so I did. I sat down, I tried to read her paper. I could not understand a single word of it. Which made me realize that, you know, somewhere along the way, like we had veered off and she could still speak my language, but I no longer could speak hers. And it felt strange to have this be the case for somebody that I know and love and had known and loved for many, many years. And so not thinking that I was going to write about it at all, I just asked her if I could go shadow her in her lab. And she very generously said yes. And that first day that I went, she was performing a surgery on her mice that I end up actually detailing in the early pages of this book. I found it so fascinating, so completely different from anything that I spend my time thinking about. And also just listening to her talk about her work and the implications that her work might have on people, I found really, really fascinating. And so at some point in all of this jumble, I thought, what if I combine that scenario of that short story that I really liked? A woman, a very intellectual woman taking care of a mother who is ill with this piece, the neuroscience piece, and see what happens. So it was many different threads that came together to form Transcendent Kingdom.
Oh, that is so good. Don't you love that though? It's like all of these little threads, and then there's this moment of it coming together and
Yeah.
almost like quilting, you know?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I
Absolutely.
love that image. It does feel like quilting somehow when you're, I don't know, sometimes I think of writing as like being given like a toothpick and a shovel and a piece of paper and a stick of gum, and you're trying to figure out how to build a house out of it. Like you're just meshing all of these things together that seem like they shouldn't fit, and somehow they can.
And they do.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find, and I'm also curious about with other writers, is for me, I have a goal of like what I would like to achieve, not in
Mm,
terms of the exact story, but what the story does for readers, and like what
mm,
Transcendent Kingdom does for me. But
yeah.
as I'm writing, I'm so insecure. I'm like, is this even working? And I guess it goes back to what you just said, right? The
Yeah.
toothpick, the piece of paper, and the shovel, and you're like, and the gum. You're like, what? You know,
Yeah.
do you have that experience where you're just like, I am in command? And so maybe that's something that, other writers we need to build, or
Mm.
does it continue to be this sort of mystery?
Mm. For me, it's a mystery. It's always a mystery from the beginning to the last sentence. I'm not a big planner. And so I don't outline, I don't have character sketches. I really feel as though the story is being revealed to me as I'm writing it, especially a first draft. Like the subsequent drafts are refining and thinking about, how to make everything fit better. But the first draft feels like nothing except for mystery and wonder and awe and discovery. Like it's the freest part for me and the best part for me. But going back to the earlier part of your question, I love that idea of like wanting to know how your book is going to make the reader feel even from the outset. I recently had the privilege of interviewing Ishiguro
Mhm.
about his new book, Clara and the Sun, and he said the same thing. He said it's really important to him that a novel linger after you finish the book, that you like have this sense of it living on, and so he's working toward that. I have never thought in those terms, but of course it's why we read. It's like the best feeling when you're reading a book is to know that even after you close the pages, it's still with you. It doesn't just disappear. It's not vapor. But how you achieve that in the writing process, that's really hard to articulate. And I don't know if it's ever like front of mind for me, but it's always the goal.
I can, well, it's definitely there because it is achieved. Um, so brava, you know.
Thank you.
I remember, and so this is such a good segue now. As I was reading it, there were so many emotions, but one, Transcendent Kingdom absolutely lingers. I've been like, all I do is think about it, and, sort of talk about it with me,
Mm-hmm.
sort of with myself. But I'll be honest, as I was reading it, at one point, I might have been somewhere in the middle. I thought, "Ah, Gifty, Gifty's getting on my nerves."
Yeah.
And I closed it, and I was really relaxed. Like I was like, I decided to just stay in bed all day, which I never do.
Mm,
And I stayed in bed and I read, like it's so luxurious. Um,
yeah.
and I closed it for a moment and I'm like, oh, why is Gifty annoying me? And I'm like, well, this sort of self-talk, when someone's behavior is triggering you in some way, oftentimes it's because it's a mirror.
Mm,
And, I'm at that point in my life where, you know, I've spent a lot of time with self-awareness. And so when I realized that, I was like, gosh, Gifty is my mirror, you
Mm.
know? And it was one of the things, or the thing that was the trigger, is when Gifty won't express herself, what
Yeah.
she's feeling, you know? She is, and there is, you write her inability to be vulnerable in such uh, an expert sort of way. I'm like, is Yaa also a psychologist? This is supposed to be neuroscience, but this is also psychology going going on here. And I kept wanting Gifty to trust, although it triggered my own relationship with distrust, and how I rely on it so deeply for safety, because that's really what she's going through, needing to feel safe when so much of her world has been disrupted. And I've read reviews, and they like to say this immigrant family, but I Gifty is not an immigrant. Gifty is actually Black American, and she's Ghanaian American, and her brother, although he was born in Ghana, is more of a technicality. Like that's part of his story, but it doesn't really mean much because he was raised in America, and what I'm trying to get at is the immigrant narrative oftentimes doesn't really, in my experience, because I'm first generation American on my mother's side. My family's from Central America. My dad is Black American. And what I sort of got, and there's so many overlaps with Gifty's life and experience and my own, where they are Ghanaian at home. But as soon as you walk out that door, you are Black American. And the book, absolutely speaks to the erasure of Black immigrants, if that makes sense. Because the immigrant narrative oftentimes does not include people who are Black or dark, brown skinned. So that's definitely our African brothers and sisters who have migrated over to the States. As soon as you step down, you're Black, and your experience is that of a Black person in America. And I feel like that eats the family.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. There's a flattening, I think, that happens when you get here, that must happen in some respects, because there's still so much baggage, so much history here when it comes to Blackness in America. But that flattening effect can also hinder what I think of as like the 1.5 to 2 generation child, the person who's straddling the line between these two countries. It can hinder them from like getting to understand themselves as either one thing or the other. Instead, you feel as though you're always in that liminal space where you have no access to either identity, because at home, your parents aren't acknowledging it. At school, your friends aren't acknowledging the other side. So where are you? Who are you? For Gifty, what I think is really, really interesting is that she's isolated within isolation. So it's not just the fact that she's from an immigrant family, but also her mother unwittingly, because of a lack of understanding about the way that race works in this country, plops them down into the white side of town of a Southern town. And here she is without Black community at all. And so there's the doubling of isolation. Not only is she not getting the answers she needs about her Ghanaian identity from a mother who is herself reticent and difficult, she's not getting any information about community from other Black people because she's in this desert. And so I think one of the questions that the book is asking us to think about is like, who would Gifty have been if she had been surrounded by community. Who would she have been if there were other Ghanaians in her life? Who would she have been if she had gone to a Black church? This kind of steady wearing away at her character, it makes her have this coping mechanism where she puts these walls up, where she is, like her mother, incredibly difficult, incredibly reticent. But you're right, it's because there's so much chaos and there's so much loneliness. She's only ever had herself and her brother, and to some extent her mother. But she knows that the only person that she can truly count on to kind of give her what she needs is herself. And that causes her to push everyone else away to her detriment.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, that is, and that, you know, just sort of grabbed me, because what I'll tie in is, you know, throughout the book, so Gifty's safe space is the lab. And it becomes the reader's safe space. Like, you know that when she's in the lab, there's very little hurt that's going to happen for the most part. And what comes up, though, again and again, is how cold she is in the lab. And, you know, it's such a layered experience, because on the one hand, the lab is really cold because her lab mate is male and men run a little warmer. And so like the default in corporate America is to have the, you know, the AC at like 65 and all the women are freezing. And, you know, she's down in she, I think it's a sweater, but you know, you can just kind of see this down Parker that she puts on every time her lab mate is there. And when he's not there, she puts the heat up, but she never asks him to meet her halfway, right? And then as I continue to read, the coldness that she is experiencing in that lab becomes a metaphor for her own sort of emotional state. She has put her feelings on ice because that is her coping method, right? And if your feelings are on ice, then no one can hurt you. And even when people do, it doesn't matter, you can walk away. I mean, come on, that's my coping method. I'm like, how did y'all get in my head? You know? I was like, this book is my therapy right now. And then, you know, as I read and read and read, and it comes up again, how cold she is, I see it also as a metaphor of like what happened to this family, this Ghanaian family, where it's almost like a limb. You know, if a limb is cut off or detached or amputated, if it's not sick, there is this ability to put it on ice and get it back to the body and reattach it. And then it can heal. But if you leave it for too long detached, then it'll die. And it becomes a metaphor almost for the family, because the family is so, like you said, isolated. And I kept thinking, like the Peel movie, get out! Get out of Alabama! You're not in the right place. Like, this is not where you thrive as a family. And were you thinking, well, clearly you were thinking about that, but were you, was the idea that this coldness that she feels, you know, to play as metaphor like that for so many different aspects of the book and the family?
Well, Keisha, I have to say I love that reading, and I'm going to take credit for what you just said.
Absolutely.
No, that didn't occur to me at all. I wasn't on a conscious level thinking about the coldness, the descriptions of the coldness in the lab as a kind of metaphor for Gifty's family. But I see it as you lay it out. Like, I feel like that's a great reading.
I got deep.
I love it. I love it.
But I also love that too, about the experience of writing and creating and the unconscious. And I also, like you, I don't outline. I've tried. It never works out.
Never.
No. But I think that sort of freestyle it's organic, and it allows the characters to really build the narrative that they would like you to show of them.
Yeah.
And it's so well done that that it became that for me. And I think about how Chin Chin and the things that Chin Chin does, their father. And am I pronouncing that right, Chin Chin?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, there's a feeling of abandonment that happens with the family, but I feel like that severing happened before Chin Chin's actions.
Yes.
You know, and it was one of the things that became discord between mother and father, was that severing. And I think about how Nana's addiction, is one of the things that formulated. And although, like, someone on the surface could say, well, it's, due to the separation, right? The father. But it's more, I find I'm very interested in addiction. Oh, just to let you know too, I'm a huge like neuroscience fan and like
Oh,
nerd.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's one of my like nerdy things that I'm
Yeah.
just like, I'm really interested in the brain. And with addiction, so a couple of things. Nana has this opioid addiction. And his story touches on so many things within America and the opioid crisis. Like, one, how so many athletes, children still, right, minors, have become addicted to opioids because of getting hurt in sports. So there is that conversation. There's also the conversation of addiction within the Black community and Black families, and how it's looked more of as a failing of our existence as Black people, but in comparison to when it's in the white community, then it's a crisis, right?
Yeah.
And so we have all of that happening. And then there's the conversation of like, that is still happening about addiction and hereditary, is it passed down within the family? And there's no one in particular in the family that ends up, addicted to drugs per se, but addiction is a huge thing in my mind because my father was a drug addict. And there's addiction on both my mother's side and father's side, like to death. Like, the addiction drove these people to death. And addiction within my like micro family, siblings and all of that. And yet I am so much like Gifty. I don't smoke, I don't abuse alcohol. I'm very moody about drinking, but I don't think that I'm not an addict. If that makes sense. I think that my addiction supersedes drinking or drugs. And I see that in Gifty, this need to control, right? It's not just habitual. It's like she can't survive without it. And we think about when we are dealing with people or family members or friends who have an alcohol or drug addiction and their inability to stop. It's almost like this, this addictive behavior. And when people are so controlling, we don't call that addiction. When someone controls and her need for loneliness as a form of self-harm almost, right? We don't call that addiction. But I do find those similarities. Were you thinking about that in any way while you were, writing all of these different characters?
I was, and I'm really happy that you picked up on that, because I think it's easy to think about Gifty's work in the lab as having to do with her brother and her mother, easy to think about that limping mouse as her brother. She's trying to save him.
Mhm.
But I think the other side of the reward seeking coin is that Gifty herself has this compulsion.
Mhm.
The way that she talks about her work, the way that she talks about her striving toward goodness, toward academic success, all of this thing is not, to me, a healthy relationship to the work.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that you're spending all of your time at a lab avoiding personal relationships with
Mhm.
people, pushing people away. That to me feels as pathologized as the things that she's talking about with her brother and her mother. She just can't see it. And the world kind of rewards her for it. And so she's never made to see it until she has people like Anne, like Raymond, who start to try to ask her to confront that part of herself, and she won't do it. And so instead of doing it, she pushes them away. But I think you're absolutely right. Her compulsions, her own addictions are there on the page. She just can't look at it. She can't look at herself, um, and won't look at herself. And so instead, she's looking outward. Here's what Nana did. Here's what my mom is
Mhm.
doing.
Mhm.
There are very few moments in the novel where you see Gifty's vulnerability, where you see her kind of examining her own mind.
Mhm.
There, the journal entries from her childhood get to it a little bit. There are moments, there are glimpses with Anne and Raymond where we get to see it a little bit. But at every opportunity, Gifty is keeping you at bay. And so she's a narrator who isn't, I don't think of her necessarily as completely unreliable. Like, she's not trying to lie to you in the way of a like Humbert and Lolita. She's not actively dishonest. The unreliability comes from the fact that she is not honest with herself about her own needs, her own problems. And so, I was aware of that. I was thinking a lot about how to do that with a first person narrator, how to
Mhm.
show what she wasn't saying, how to
Mhm.
see around her so that we could examine her own compulsions, her own addictions, and kind of put her in conversation with her mother and her brother and her father and their issues. Yeah.
Oh, that's so great because it absolutely comes through. And she keeps you so far away, but you do have that opportunity. And also, this opportunity, and it depends on, where a reader is in their own life in terms of, if they have similarities, to be able to like also see themselves, that
Yeah.
self-awareness. And I'm just like, Gifty, girl, you can get there, it's not going to be perfect because I'm not, but like,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and is it Catherine? Is it her
Mm-hmm.
friend Catherine?
Mm-hmm.
Her friend
Mm-hmm.
Catherine comes in like a fresh of breath air and is
Yeah.
very gentle,
Yeah.
and you just love that this woman and this doctor and just this other human being sees Gifty and
Yeah.
is like, tell me more, and then finds out more that like, her mother's staying with her.
Yeah.
um and I think about like how that's such a blessing, just within our lives as humans, to have another human being, who says, I'm going to be here for you in the way that I can, and I think it does change things for her. And I believe, and tell me this, because now this is like Gifty gossip.
Yes.
Like, does Gifty at some point go to therapy? Because I feel
Ooh,
like she does move forward in her life, you
she
know?
does. Yeah. Yeah, she does. I haven't like decided in my own head what Gifty's trajectory is beyond the novel, but I'd like to think, given what Catherine does professionally outside of her research, the reason that Catherine is able to draw Gifty out in the ways that she does is because she has this history as a psychiatrist, and so she's using those tools, and she's not just a friend, she's also, I think, like trying, she sees what we're talking about in terms of Gifty's own issues, and is trying to kind of draw her out. And so my hope is that with Catherine's influence and Catherine's patience, and also the kind of development of friendships that last beyond, you know, a year or so, that Gifty starts to kind of break those walls down and recognize that she does need more help than what she's getting. So in my vision of Gifty getting to the finish line, getting to that place that we see in the last chapter of the book, she does go to therapy. She does, you know, start to open up to people. She does let Catherine in. She lets Han in. Yeah.
It's fantastic. And I also, so, you know, the family, you know, we've talked about this family and the fact that they're severed from Ghana, you know, their roots, their family. And in such an interesting way, in the way that like my mother also, you know, disconnected from Honduras and an extended family, and it was very isolating growing up. And so what ends up happening as I'm reading the book, you know, along with the severing that happens, although the children know that they're from Ghana, you know, that this is where our family roots are from, they end up having basically this, they end up falling, how can I put this? Like, put this in a nice way. They end up becoming devoured by the rottenness that exists, which is racism, right? And inequality. And so it at some point, it just feels, it is such a metaphor for the Black American experience. Like many Black Americans, I mean, people are doing the swab now, which is really great.
Yeah.
And you know, my family did it, and we are actually part Ghanaian.
Oh wow.
I claim the entire continent, but
Aquava, we claim you.
but we are actually Ghanaian, Nigerian, Senegalese, Congolese, and Ethiopian. A lot of mixing going on there.
Yeah.
My sister. I already claimed it, but you know, like now it's proof. But what this Ghanaian family ends up, or these, I want to say just like Gifty and Nana in particularly, but like their parent also, is they end up having this experience, and we've talked about this already, of just like the Black American, whether or not you know your roots, it doesn't matter when you're here. Because, you know, inequity and basically racism is violent and it's aggressive. You know, like I don't think there are many passive racists out there. If so, whoa, you know, and so they end up falling victim to that. And I feel like, can you just speak a little more to that? Because there is a severing, but there's such a duality that speaks to the Black American experience, whether or not you know where your family is from, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think with my first novel, with Homegoing, I was thinking a lot about this question of what it means to be Black in America, what we have inherited on both sides, whether it's the immigrant or the African American, what we have been left with. That was kind of the guiding principle of that novel. And because it's generational, you get to see the kind of impact of trauma over many years. With Transcendent Kingdom, it's quieter. Like the way that the racism works in this novel is quieter. I think of this moment where Gifty is talking about overhearing these two women at her church discussing Nana's addiction. And what she says is that she thinks of that moment as a spiritual wound a wound that takes her years to find and address. And that's what the racism in this book feels like to me. Like it's not the kind of naked, overt, explicit racism that we see and hear about. It's that almost internalized racism that Gifty is experiencing in those moments where she expresses things like sentiments like, I don't want to be thought of as a Black scientist, as a woman scientist. Like that to me feels like I can't claim those identities because I recognize that those identities have been used against me, used against people who do claim them. There's a really excellent essay by Langston Hughes called "The Negro and the Mountain." I might be getting that title wrong, but it's about this very idea. He's talking about a young poet he meets who says, "The Negro and the Racial Mountain," I think it's called. He's talking about a young poet who he meets who doesn't want to be thought of as a Black poet, and Hughes goes on to kind of break that idea down. And what he comes to is this conclusion that what that young man is feeling is racism. Like what he's experiencing is the way that that the institutions have made him feel as though to claim that identity would be to somehow devalue his work. And so rather than like using it as a strength, rather than recognizing that your Blackness is in part your power, you subvert it. And so Gifty and Nana and their parents to some extent are walking in this inheritance of not, again, that isolation, like not having the Ghanaian identity to bolster them, the Ghanaian community to bolster them, and then hearing all of this messaging about how awful it is to be Black, right? If you're the only Black person in your community, at school, at church, what you're hearing over and over and over again is how awful it is. And as we know from this novel, Gifty is a person who very much likes to be good. She likes to be right. She wants to be on the right side of things. And so to kind of allow herself to delve into the psychology of that internalized racism is not a skill that I think she yet has in the early parts of this book. Like she's working toward it by the time we get to the end, but I don't see her as somebody who is capable, as she says about that spiritual wound, it has taken me years to find and address it, and still I don't always see it. And there's so many moments in this novel where we see her not seeing it. Yeah.
And, you know, I related to that. And I think, you know, it is such, it speaks to, you know, living in brown skin, you know, it feels like it's almost as if like you're constantly being shattered, sort of destroyed. And then you have to go home and put the pieces back together again before you venture out into the world. And, you know, it was on page 174, I have it marked, that speaks to this. You know, Gifty says, what I'm saying is I didn't grow up with a language for a way to explain, to parse out my self-loathing. And I feel like that sort of self-loathing is such a part of the American culture in of itself, right? And then it takes on all of these different sort of forms of racism, of anti-LGBT and anti-trans, not seeing our disabled community at all as if they're non-existent, and so much more, and you know, harming children and classism, all the isms, you know?
Yeah.
And so that sort of brings me to Chin Chin, who is, you know, they're such a beautiful family. And I don't know, I root for them. And I believe, like, this is what I've come with, you know, I experience, like, I understand Nana and Gifty's experience of abandonment, because I've experienced that too. My father wasn't in our lives. But like Chin Chin, my father was a good person, even though he was addicted to drugs. As I read, I don't believe Chin Chin would have survived had he not done what he did. You know, this 6'4" Black man in Alabama on the white side of town. I don't think he would have survived. And you know, do you believe that also?
I think that I do. I think it's complicated because he did a horrible thing from the familial perspective,
Mhm.
from the personal perspective. But I do also think that he did the right thing for him, which
Mhm.
is that he didn't want to go. He was explicit up front that he didn't really understand why they needed to leave. He loved his people. He loved his country. He
Yeah.
loved the food. He was close to his mother. Why are we moving for something a little bit better? What does that even mean?
Mhm.
And then B, to get there and to recognize not just the amount of struggle that it's going to take in order to survive this place, but to also, for the first time in his life, as a Black person in a predominantly white country, rather than being a Black person in a predominantly Black country, for the first time in his life, he's understanding and seeing anti-Black racism. And he cannot, he refuses it,
Mhm.
essentially. He refuses it. And what it looks like to everyone else is that he's refusing his family. Which of course, those two things aren't mutually exclusive here. He is in some ways. But I think when we get to that part at the end where Gifty's mother is kind of reflecting back and wondering what might have saved her son's life, and she says, I should have sent him home. I should
Mhm.
have sent him home with his father when his father asked for him.
Mhm.
What we're seeing is that complication here. Like what part of the like unraveling of this family has to do with the fact that they moved, that they stayed in a place that was hostile to their progress, hostile to their becoming. There's something in the mother's personality that I find really interesting, that the book doesn't really like deeply explore what happens in her life in Ghana to make her the kind of person who like digs her heels in
Mhm.
when she starts to see trouble. But I loved Mbola Mbwe's book, Behold the Dreamers, and one thing that I loved about that book is that the family leaves. They like go home at the end. And that's the immigrant narrative and fiction that you don't often see and you don't see celebrated. Like we
Yeah.
love to talk. I'm a first generation immigrant. We love to talk about how hard it is, how much we struggled. But then you wonder, particularly when you come from a country like Ghana, where it's a great place. People are happy.
Yeah.
People are maybe poor, but they're living nice lives.
Yeah.
So when you pit that against the struggle, the narrative of the struggle, you think, is the money worth all of this? Like, is having some more money worth
Yeah.
that? And that's what Gifty's mother has to ask in those last chapters when she's thinking about her son's addiction. Like, was this decision worth it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because as I read it, I have one of my good friends. She's half Gambian, half Puerto Rican, and she was born in New York. But her mother and father sent her back to Gambia like every summer. And so she
Mm-hmm.
has such a strong connection. She speaks the language, she speaks Wolof,
Yeah.
you know. And Gifty is reminds me of like myself. She doesn't speak much Twi, is Twi, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know, I don't speak much Spanish. And
Mm-hmm.
it, just like all the severing. But I think about the family, and I feel like they would have been so much more, they would have been more successful. They would have been safer, and they would have been just as successful. Gifty could have still done all of this education and, gone to school here in the States and everything that she wanted to do for college and PhD
Yeah.
without that like young experience and looking at the mother. There's that one time where the mother, when Gifty is in Ghana for the summer. And her aunt goes, "Oh, your mother always thought she was better than, better than the rest of us." And then, there's that little insight where it's just like, where does this doggedness come from this, with this mother, to do that? And, I'm at a point in my life where I feel, I lived in West Africa for 4 years and then came back to the States because I missed my family, you know? And then you get here and you're like, did I really miss you all that much? I don't think so. And, I've been thinking about like, what would it mean for my own life to move abroad and not have this have to be my everyday that we see in the news, because it affects everyone. It affects all of us. It's not normal, but it's normal in America, you know? And I think about other writers like Baldwin, who, moved to the south of France and spent his last days and the rest of his life there. And the question of like, would he have lived into his 80s had he not done that? The sort of question of just like survival, one of the things, I'm going to ask you one last question, and it has to do with the fact that I would love to hear you talk about, and if anybody has any questions, I see 2 questions here. All right, so we have 2 questions, and then I'm going to ask you this question.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the experience for us writers, right? And I'm a debut, and my book debuted during the pandemic. Can you just talk a little bit about the experience of publishing during normal times and how that felt? And then the experience of publishing during the pandemic, because I usually get advice from writers who published non-pandemic, and they think, they're like, what's wrong with you, Keisha? And I'm just like, it's a pandemic. I'm angry, So can you just talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, my heart goes out to anyone who had to debut their novel during this time, debut their book during this time, because it is just harder. The amount of eyes on the page that you need for a debut to work is diminished by the virtual landscape. Like, you're not getting foot traffic into bookstores where people can listen to booksellers tell you what new thing you should be buying. You're not seeing the books with their spines out at the store on the shelves. So that quality of getting people, that word of mouth quality of getting people to your book is really hard if you're a debut author who doesn't have a platform already built in, from whatever, like your influencer career on the side. Like, if you don't have that, to be trying to kind of drum up attention during this moment would be incredibly, incredibly hard. For me, with Homegoing, I was really fortunate in that I had this publishing house that really, really went all in. I feel like even before the book came out, like I was, doing media lunches. I was like going to meet people for interviews and all of that stuff before the book came out. And then the tour was pretty substantial too. So I can't even remember how many places I went to on that hardback tour. But it was a lot, even for like in the before times. And so it felt like a robust attempt at making sure that this book, that most people would at least have seen that cover of this book in some capacity. So I feel very, very fortunate that people put in that kind of work and that kind of time to make that possible. It was a long tour, and I think because I'm not like on the internet really, it was really helpful to me to be able to be out and about in the world meeting people in order to get my book out there, because I wasn't tweeting about it and I wasn't really on Instagram or Facebook. Like I didn't have that other that other kind of propulsion method. For Transcendent Kingdom, it was a second book, and so there was already this goodwill toward me from people who had read the first one and were excited to pick up the second one. And so I didn't have to, again, worry as much about people coming to the virtual events. Like it felt as though as though people had already kind of heard about the books. There's so much that I miss about the in-person tour, about the times before, like too many things to be able to name. But you mentioned before that you did the swab, that you found out where you come from. One of the most beautiful things that happened to me over and over again during the homegoing tour was how many people would come up to me in after events to talk about having done that, and to tell me where they were from, to tell me this one woman was taking Shui with her daughter, and she was like trying to practice with me. Like I've just found it so moving to think that something that I had written could like launch this this very physical response in a person, that they would seek out that kind of information. So I don't get those kind of conversations now here in the virtual sphere. Like, we're gonna say goodbye in a few minutes, and then I won't get to even see this audience. And so it's a loss for sure. And again, all the more so if it's your first time and you never get to have that previous moment. So really, really night and day, these two experiences. The one like positive thing I will say is that the virtual landscape allows people to come from anywhere in the world. And so it's really, really wonderful, because oftentimes the physical tours, you would end up going to major cities on the coasts, and you missed out on a lot of places where people would probably still be interested in seeing an event. And now with virtual, they can. So I imagine that there will be some kind of hybrid moving forward to allow for people to get to attend events in places that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to. But yeah, there's much to be desired.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I'm not going crazy, not yet.
No, not at all, not at all.
I love the idea, though, that some places are talking about hybrid events. I think in-person events should be accessible, should be recorded so people can view them. I saw the Toni Morrison, Juno Diaz conversation at New York Public Library, because thank goodness they streamed it as the event was going on. And so hopefully going forward, more places do that. So I have a question from someone in the audience, and it is a quick question. In what way is Gifty based on you, and how is she most different from you?
I think I borrowed a lot from place to write this novel. Like I was born in Ghana, I grew up mostly in Alabama, and I also had the same experience as Gifty of being on the southeast side of Huntsville, which is the predominantly white side. And so that feeling that I was expressing earlier in this talk of isolation is one that I know well. Though unlike Gifty, my parents are very, very, very concerned with making sure that we always have community everywhere we go. So we were, like my mom was president of the Ghana Association of Huntsville. Like they did what they could to make sure that there was continuity. But place, I think, is the thing that's most similar to me, or the thing that I thought about most. And then the second piece is that I was also raised in the church. And so the religious aspects of this book are ones that are true to me.
And familiar. We didn't even get a chance to even go down that road, because that's also very similar. I grew up Jehovah's Witness and then Muslim with a second marriage. And so just so many similarities. The last question is, how long did it take for you to complete your first draft of Transcendent Kingdom?
That's a good question. The first draft took probably a year and a half. So relatively short in the world of novel writing. But as I said before, I had already written that short story that felt like a kind of a template for what I wanted to do when I built it out. So, so I think a year and a half from first idea to first sentence to last sentence of the first draft.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So we have actually hit 8 o'clock. Oh man. All right. So we did an hour.
We did.
This has been so great. Yeah. Like, I don't know. You're just like a star, you know, like not like a star in the sky for me. Like I love the moon. I love nighttime, like an actual star in the literary world and in the world of, you know, Black women writing and just writing for everyone and bringing people in and just, you know, telling stories that change people's lives and allow these characters to linger. And that's just, I don't know, that's a blessing. I feel blessed.
Thank you, Keisha.
To be alive during this time and to connect and to read your work. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I would love to, I want to thank Magic City Books for having us. And, you know, everyone have a wonderful night. And if there's anything, Yaa, that you would just love to add, because I know sometimes your events, you know, they kind of end, but if there's anything that you would love to add, you can, you can do that.
Just another thank you to you, Keisha, for reading this book with such care, and to Magic City Books for having me. I hope to one day be on the ground in Tulsa.
Yeah. Please, I know, it would be wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.